Case 1. Peter Popoff. A trembling woman stands at the edge of a crowded stage, clutching her stomach, face twisted with pain, while television cameras sweep across rows of worshippers, whispering prayers like they're afraid to breathe too loudly. The man holding the microphone looks calm and almost bored, as if this moment has happened 1,000 times. Peter Popoff leans in and suddenly calls her by name, a name she never gave him, then rattles off her address, her ailment, even the medication she takes each morning. Gasps ripple through the audience. This isn't just a healing service. This is a revelation. The woman sobs, collapsing as Popoff presses his hand to her forehead. "Be healed in the name of Jesus," he shouts. And just like that, she's upright, claiming the pain is gone. The roar of the crowd is deafening. People around her shake, cry, and raise their hands into the air. To the millions watching on late-night Christian television, this is proof of supernatural power, incontrovertible evidence that God is speaking directly through the man with the microphone. But beneath the thunder of applause and the halo of TV lighting, something colder and far more calculated is happening. Peter Popoff didn't just stumble into fame, he built it, piece by piece, like an illusionist perfecting a trick. Born in Germany and raised in California, he learned early how to perform in the charismatic revival culture of traveling tent meetings. He studied audience psychology and mastered the art of word of knowledge, a supposed divine ability to reveal personal information no ordinary person could know. With each broadcast, donations poured in. Viewers mailed prayer cards with their sickness, address, urgent needs, and personal details, all things Popoff claimed he never knew in advance. His persona was built on one core idea: God was speaking miracles in real time through Peter Popoff. Then came one of the most legendary exposures in religious history. Skeptical investigator James Randi, a magician, escape artist, and debunker, suspected Popoff's miracles were nothing more than performance. Randi's team attended live services posing as believers. They noticed something strange. Popoff would pause slightly before listing personal details, as if he were listening to something. Randi brought in a radio scanner. During a televised miracle service, his team swept frequencies in the venue, and suddenly, the truth hit like a lightning strike. A woman's voice crackled through the headphones. It was Popoff's wife, Elizabeth, reading prayer card information: name, illness, address, family history. And Popoff repeated everything exactly as if God had revealed it. The sting only grew more dramatic. On The Tonight Show starring Johnny Carson, Randi played audio recordings of Elizabeth Popoff feeding information to her husband through a hidden wireless earpiece. Millions watched in stunned silence. Overnight, Popoff transformed from miracle worker to con artist. His supernatural healings, carefully crafted for television, collapsed under the weight of cold technical evidence. The moment James Randi explained that Popoff used a basic radio frequency to fake divine revelation, the evangelical world was shaken. Within months, Peter Popoff declared bankruptcy. His ministry folded. The late-night shows mocked him. Donors felt deceived and betrayed. For many believers, it shattered confidence not just in Popoff, but in televised healing ministries altogether. Yet the story didn't end there. In one of the strangest turns of all, Popoff slowly crawled back onto television in the 2000s, offering miracle spring water, financial breakthrough promises, and debt cancellation kits. He never acknowledged the scandal, never apologized for the earpiece, and never admitted to the deception that brought his empire crashing down. But he could never escape his legacy. In expose after expose, his name became synonymous with fake healings and televised fraud. Peter Popoff didn't just fake miracles. He changed the way miracle claims are investigated forever, becoming the case everybody refers to when asking a single, haunting question: how many of the healings we watch are actually real, and how many are just staged illusions designed to get our money? Welcome to Savage Case Files, If you're fascinated by true crime stories, you're in the right place. Take a moment right now to subscribe to the channel. Your support keeps this channel alive, keeps us working on the next story, and make sure these cases don't get forgotten. So go ahead, hit that subscribe button, and turn on notifications. Case 2. W.V. Grant. The auditorium lights always dimmed at the exact same moment, right when W.V. Grant ordered someone in a wheelchair to stand up. The crowd erupted in applause as metal crutches hit the floor and back braces were stacked like trophies beside the stage. For nearly 2 decades, Grant crafted an image as one of America's most dramatic faith healers. He promised spontaneous leg lengthening, supernatural spinal correction, and instant mobility for those who could no longer walk. At his most theatrical, he would walk into a service surrounded by ushers carrying bags of discarded medical equipment. Proof, he said, that his ministry was a conveyor belt of miracles. Congregants gasped, television cameras zoomed in, and every story felt larger than life. There was no time to question anything, because Grant never gave people time to breathe. One dramatic healing rolled straight into the next, creating a whirlwind of emotion that swept people into belief. At first, Grant's rise looked unstoppable. He preached with a high-octane style that blended old-school tent revival theatrics with modern televangelist media savvy. He knew how to build suspense, how to elevate tension, and how to create the precise moment when a miracle seemed inevitable. But under the stage lights and choir music, there was something else happening. Something far more calculated than spiritual. Investigators would later say the healings were not spontaneous at all, but carefully choreographed events that relied on planted audience members and props acquired from thrift stores. Former insiders described a system in which Grant's team collected crutches, braces, slings, and walkers in advance, then brought them on stage to create the illusion of mass healings. The first cracks in the miracle machine appeared when journalists noticed familiar faces. One man, featured as healed of a terminal spinal disorder in Dallas, appeared months later, in a different city, at a different revival, claiming to be healed of paralyzed legs by Grant again. Local reporters began attending services with cameras hidden in bags, filming repeated miracles performed on the exact same people. When they tracked those individuals after the event, no medical documentation supported the claims. The moment that pulled the curtain back came when investigators discovered boxes of medical equipment in Grant's storage unit, some still featuring thrift store price tags. That discovery became the linchpin for multiple reports exposing the illusion of authenticity. But the real blow did not come from journalists. It came from the federal government. In the 1990s, Grant was indicted and later convicted of tax fraud, with prosecutors arguing that millions in ministry donations were hidden from the IRS. The case detailed years of financial misrepresentation, secret accounts, and deceptive bookkeeping that masked personal spending behind the facade of miracle crusades. Overnight, the flamboyant healer who brought thousands to their feet in worship now faced the possibility of years behind bars. When a judge handed down a prison sentence, the shock within his following rippled across charismatic and Pentecostal communities nationwide. People who once shouted hallelujah at his services were now reading federal case files and wondering whether the miracles they believed in ever truly happened. W.V. Grant served his sentence, returned to ministry after his release, and continues to preach to this day, though never again with the same national profile he once commanded. To his loyalists, the exposure was exaggerated and unfair. To his critics, the case remains one of the most blatant examples of staged healings in modern American revival history. But the one undeniable truth is this: the spectacle of crutches and braces piled by the stage never meant proof of divine intervention, only proof of how far a determined showman will go to convince people that the impossible just happened right before their eyes. Case 3. Leroy Jenkins. Long before televised miracle crusades filled late-night cable, Leroy Jenkins was already selling supernatural hope by the bottle. His meetings had a signature moment. Jenkins would stride to center stage holding a tall glass vial filled with cloudy, miracle water. The crowd would lean forward, hungry, desperate, and hanging on every word. He claimed it came straight from the Jordan River, infused with divine power and capable of doing what doctors could not. Cancer? Gone. Blindness? Restored. Blood diseases? He said he'd seen them vanish. He would dip his fingers into the water, touch someone's forehead, and then push them backward as ushers caught their falling bodies. Every time a person staggered to their feet claiming healing, the crowd roared. Jenkins always promised the same thing: believe, sow a seed, and watch a miracle happen. But underneath the theatrics was a product that could barely pass a health inspection. Investigators began noticing patterns in the supposed healings. No doctor verification, no medical records, just emotional testimonies shouted into a microphone after a dramatic touch. It was a journalist, not a minister, who finally cracked the surface. Local news outlets began questioning where the water was really coming from. Jenkins said he bottled it from holy springs, even implying divine origins beyond human contamination. When pressed, he changed the story repeatedly, sometimes a well in South Carolina, sometimes a secret reservoir, sometimes nowhere at all. The turning point came when health officials got involved. Samples of the water were submitted to a state lab for analysis. What they found had nothing holy about it. The miracle water was contaminated with dangerous bacteria, so polluted that drinking it could cause illness, not healing. In some tests, it failed basic public safety standards. Jenkins had been charging money for a product unfit for human consumption while claiming it could cure terminal disease. The results went public, splashing across headlines with devastating clarity. There was no miracle, only hazardous water and a preacher banking on blind trust. The exposure did more than break Jenkins' image. It destroyed the illusion his services depended on. Families who had spent savings for bottles of holy cure demanded answers. People who swore they felt fire in their body suddenly wondered if it was emotional hype rather than supernatural power. News outlets replayed the investigation footage again and again, showing the lab reports, the bottled samples, and Jenkins' evasive answers to basic questions. Authorities finally stepped in. Leroy Jenkins faced legal consequences, including fraud charges connected to his healing sales. His ministry, once thriving on dramatic claims and televised testimonies, collapsed under the weight of lawsuits and public scrutiny. The flamboyant preacher, who once built entire services around a vial of water, was now forced to defend himself in courtrooms rather than on church stages. Yet the story didn't end with conviction. Like many exposed miracle workers, Jenkins continued to preach off and on, refusing to abandon the persona he'd crafted, but the mystique was gone. He could no longer hold up a bottle and guarantee supernatural results without listeners remembering the lab tests and bacterial contamination that proved it was all a lie. The most devastating part of the Leroy Jenkins saga wasn't the fraud itself. It was the people who truly believed. The dying mother who drank the water and begged for healing. The chronically ill man who sent his last paycheck to activate a miracle. The families who clung to hope after every doctor had given up. Jenkins exploited the most vulnerable emotion a person can have, the desire not to suffer anymore. And when the truth surfaced, that betrayal became impossible to forget. When a preacher claims something as small as a bottle of water can cure what medicine cannot, the question isn't just whether the miracle is real. It's what happens when belief becomes a business and desperation becomes a revenue stream. Case 4. A. Allen. There was a time in mid-century America when A. Allen's tent revivals felt like the epicenter of supernatural power. Thousands pressed into canvas sanctuaries across the South and Midwest, desperate for a miracle, desperate to see one of Allen's signature deliverance moments where demons fled, diseases vanished, and lifelong disabilities were supposedly healed in seconds. Under a flood of stage lights, Allen moved with dramatic conviction. He shouted, he cried, he laid hands on the sick, and people fell as if invisible force had swept through the crowd. The music swelled. Testimonies echoed through the microphone, and listeners on the Miracle Revival Hour radio program heard story after story of transformation. It was intoxicating, especially for those who had reached the end of hope. But in the shadows of the revival tents, an entirely different story unfolded. Former workers later described how each miracle night began long before Allen stepped on stage. Assistants scouted the entrance lines, searching for people with dramatic illnesses and disabilities. Volunteers gathered names, conditions, and backstories. If someone claimed to have migraines or chronic pain, problems that can't be verified on the spot, they were flagged as perfect candidates for a dramatic, instant healing. When those individuals were later called to the platform, Allen appeared to miraculously reveal information only God could know, though his team had collected it just hours earlier. And there were even darker tactics. Investigators and disgruntled insiders recounted how some testimonies were simply staged. People were coached to describe long-term suffering, sudden healing, demonic deliverance, or relief from mental torment, even if nothing actually happened. The audience believed not because of evidence, but because of emotion, spectacle, and the power of suggestion. Allen exploited something very simple and very human. Desperation within the roar of 1,000 voices, with organs playing behind him and a microphone amplifying every syllable. Doubt was drowned out. When someone fell backwards or shouted that they were healed, the crowd surged with belief. In a tent full of people, no one wanted to be the cynic. Everyone wanted a miracle. As Allen's reputation grew, so did the money. The tent revivals expanded into broadcast ministries, letter campaigns, and an ever-growing demand for donations. He used urgent language, claiming that giving financially prepared the way for breakthroughs and deliverance. Supporters mailed checks and cash, believing they were sowing seeds for impossible healing. But outside of the revival environment, cracks in the narrative became visible. Doctors began reporting that healed individuals still suffered from their same conditions. Some never improved at all. Former team members admitted that the ministry put emotional testimonies above verifiable results. When pastors and skeptics questioned Allen's methods, they were dismissed as faithless or attacking God's anointed. The truth came to a head after Allen's unexpected death in 1970. Official reports described acute alcohol poisoning, and press speculation spread fast. The healer, who once condemned worldly sin, was discovered alone in a hotel room with bottles everywhere. Immediately, supporters tried to spin the story, calling it satanic attack or persecution, but former associates opened up about Allen's struggles, not just with alcohol, but with the pressure to constantly produce dramatic results. One whistleblower described the system plainly. If there wasn't a miracle, we made one. The momentum of the ministry demanded supernatural proof every night, and where there was no miracle, manipulation filled the gap. In the decades since, A. Allen's revivals have become a case study in how showmanship can masquerade as supernatural power. His methods laid groundwork that later televangelists copied. The pre-screened prayer lines, whispered information, staged testimonies, and emotional coercion dressed as faith. Allen left behind no criminal sentence, but he left thousands of wounded followers who believed they were healed, only to face reality alone. And behind all the noise, his legacy became a cautionary tale, not about belief itself, but about what happens when a leader prioritizes spectacle over truth and hope over honesty. Case 5. Robert Tilton. The letters came in by the thousands, stacked in plastic mail bins and hauled into Robert Tilton's ministry offices like a constant tidal wave of desperation. People wrote from hospital rooms, prison cells, nursing homes, and kitchen tables, describing illnesses, family breakdown, financial ruin, and prayers that never seemed to be answered. Tilton promised something no doctor, therapist, or pastor could guarantee. If they would send those letters along with a seed offering, he would pray personally over their requests, and God would release miracle healing in return. In late-night TV broadcasts, he read testimonies in a trembling voice, weeping and shouting hallelujah as he claimed instant cures and supernatural breakthroughs. The formula seemed divine: one letter, one donation, one miracle. And for a time, millions believed it. At the peak of his influence in the late 1980s and early 90s, Tilton dominated religious television. His show, Success and Life, was everywhere, syndicated nationally, and reaching an audience of more than 3 million viewers per week. He wasn't just preaching, he was selling hope. Families scraped together whatever they could to send money, $20, $100, sometimes thousands. Tilton told viewers to place their bills against the screen while he prayed, promising healing for tumors, heart conditions, mental illness, addictions, and anything else that tormented them. He said he was writing their names down, putting prayer requests on his personal altar, and keeping those papers near him until the miracle happened. For the sick and the hopeless, that promise felt like oxygen. Then, in November 1991, everything changed in a single hour of network television. ABC's Primetime Live launched an investigation that would become one of the most explosive exposés in televangelist history. Hidden cameras and dumpster dives revealed the truth Tilton never wanted anyone to see. Investigators found mounds of prayer request letters, thousands of them, dumped in trash bins behind his ministry buildings in Tulsa. The letters were still sealed, still full of heartbreak, still containing personal medical diagnoses and pleas for life-saving intervention. What was missing were the checks, the cash, and the donations, which had already been removed and processed. Tilton wasn't praying over anything. He was collecting money, throwing away the grief, and keeping the profit. The broadcast showed workers admitting that Tilton never even handled the letters. They said the envelopes were opened in batches, cash removed, and the written requests sent straight to the trash or shredded. It was corporate procedure, not spiritual warfare. As the footage aired, viewers across America watched decades of illusion collapse in real time. The man who had promised intimate prayer connection was exposed as someone who treated prayer requests like accounting paperwork. The show also revealed that Tilton had hired marketing firms to pre-screen mail from zip codes known to give more money. It wasn't ministry, it was data-driven fundraising designed to target financial vulnerability. Tilton denied everything. He called ABC liars, accused investigators of setting him up, and claimed he always prayed over every request. But the images were too powerful to overcome. Dumpsters full of unread letters, trash bags filled with prayers, every envelope a broken promise. Lawsuits followed. Donors demanded accountability. State investigators launched inquiries into his finances. And Success and Life, once the biggest religious TV show in America, disappeared from national broadcast. Robert Tilton eventually declared bankruptcy and left his Oklahoma ministry behind, only to later resurface with new broadcasts and smaller congregations. But the stain of that scandal never washed out. His name became shorthand for everything people fear about miracle money religion: the betrayal of trust, the exploitation of pain, and the chilling realization that some of the most emotional, spiritual experiences on television were nothing more than business transactions disguised as divine intervention. Tilton proclaimed that he had the spiritual power to heal bodies and change destinies. But what he left behind were broken bank accounts, unanswered letters, and tens of thousands of people wondering if their most intimate prayers were ever heard by anyone at all. Case 6. Marjo Gortner. There is no organ swell, no trembling crowd, no mysterious surge of divine power, just the blunt, shocking honesty of a former child preacher sitting in front of a camera and explaining exactly how miracle healing works when you're trained to fake it. Marjo Gortner grew up inside revival tents and television studios, a tiny golden-headed boy with a pulpit voice that sounded larger than life. To audiences in the 1950s and 60s, he was an angelic prodigy. slaying grown adults in the spirit, declaring blind eyes open and commanding pain to vanish. People swooned. People wept. People surrendered their wallets because they believed God was moving through a boy who appeared too young to deceive them. But behind the staged chaos and dramatic collapses, Marjo was doing something that no one expected: memorizing tricks, practicing emotional trigger phrases, learning to read a room faster than any con artist. His parents were his coaches, and the church was their business. By the time he was a teenager, Marjo knew every technique for a perfect fake healing. He explained years later that the key wasn't magic, it was psychology. Watch someone's breathing change as they enter the prayer line. Touch their forehead firmly to create a shock response. Use crowd momentum to convince them something supernatural is happening. Say, "I feel the heat of God on you," in a warm, confident tone, and half the time they'll actually report feeling it. And, most importantly, get them into a state of expectation, because once they believe a miracle is happening, their body and brain will often go along with it. None of this was divine. All of it was theater. For decades, Marjo played the role to perfection. He traveled with revival crews. He learned how to whisper dramatic phrases in someone's ear to make them sway and collapse, and he watched as envelopes full of cash poured in from hopeful believers who thought they had witnessed real deliverance. But eventually, the guilt and disillusionment grew too loud to ignore. In 1971, something unprecedented happened. Instead of silently leaving the ministry, Marjo decided to expose the entire industry from the inside. He agreed to let a documentary crew follow him on his last revival tour. Not just the altar calls, but the backstage planning, the hotel room conversations, and the phone calls where teams discussed crowd control and financial strategy. What resulted became the 1972 Oscar-winning documentary Marjo, one of the most devastating pieces of evidence ever recorded against the faith-healing world. On camera, he breaks down the exact mechanics of slain-in-the-spirit moments. He laughs about how easily money flows when you get someone crying and put your hand on their shoulder. He shows the camera stacks of cash on motel beds at the end of a night, bragging that he can bring in thousands from one performance. And then, in quieter moments, he admits something darker: that he never actually believed any of it. He just knew how to manipulate the emotional hunger of desperate people. The documentary stunned viewers because it didn't just accuse someone of fakery, it demonstrated it, step by step. Millions who had never questioned televised miracles suddenly saw the strings being pulled. Pastors who had once used Marjo as a poster child fell silent, scrambling to distance their ministries from the revelation. And for many who saw the film, questions lingered long after the credits. If one miracle superstar could fake everything so convincingly, how many others were doing the same? Marjo left preaching, but he didn't fade entirely. He acted in films, gave interviews, and occasionally talked about the lingering guilt of his youth. Yet his legacy remained something far greater than a childhood novelty act. He became the whistleblower that prosperity healers never wanted. To this day, documentary journalists cite Marjo as the moment the curtain first got ripped open on modern faith-healing deception. He didn't just confess, he proved it, frame by frame, destroying the illusion of supernatural power for millions and forcing the world to confront an uncomfortable truth. When the cameras roll and the choir swells, what looks like a miracle might only be a performance practiced since childhood. Case 7. Benny Hinn. There is a particular sound associated with Benny Hinn's crusades. A roaring swell of music, the sudden intake of breath from thousands of people, and then a collective eruption as bodies fall backward in waves across an arena floor. For years, this spectacle defined his ministry. Stadiums packed with desperate families, wheelchairs lined in aisles, and cameras zeroing in at the exact moment Hinn would thrust his hand forward or swing a jacket through the air. To millions around the world, it looked like undeniable proof of supernatural power. People claimed cancers vanished, deaf ears opened, tumors disappeared in seconds. But beneath the bright lights and thunderous choirs, a darker truth slowly surfaced, one that hinged not on healing, but on deception. Benny Hinn did not start out as a fraud in the eyes of his followers. Born in Israel and raised in Canada, he came to ministry through charismatic revival culture. By the late 1980s and early 1990s, he had become one of the most recognizable televangelists in the world. His broadcasts on TBN, his best-selling books, and his miracle crusades turned him into a global figure. Yet, almost from the beginning, journalists and investigators questioned the legitimacy of his healing claims. Hinn told audiences that verified medical miracles happened at virtually every event. But when reporters asked for names, medical documentation, or follow-up evidence, the trail always seemed to vanish. The first major cracks appeared during a series of investigative reports. CBC's Fifth Estate, HBO's Question of Miracles, and Inside Edition all followed Heal's crusades, tracking individual healed participants before, during, and after events. What they discovered was shocking, less for what happened on stage than for what failed to happen afterward. People walked across the stage claiming they no longer needed oxygen tanks or wheelchairs, but weeks later, many were right back where they started. Reporters confronted the ministry, seeking verifiable evidence, medical records, doctor contacts, independent assessments. But the answers were vague, evasive, or simply non-existent. Former staff added another layer of indictment. Ex-employees described how people chosen for on-stage healings were often pre-screened based on already improving conditions, dramatic appearances, or emotional vulnerability. Security teams turned away individuals with visible degenerative illnesses, terminal cancer, advanced ALS, or severe disability, steering them to prayer areas far from the cameras. Meanwhile, those who responded enthusiastically to pre-show warm-up staff were encouraged to come forward during the televised portion of the crusade. None of this proved deliberate medical fraud, but it revealed a carefully engineered environment where perceived miracles were more likely because they were curated. Perhaps the most damning element was psychological. Investigators filmed interactions in specific seating sections known as hot zones, where emotionally charged volunteers worked to persuade attendees they had already been healed before Hinn even walked on stage. The audience, primed with music, testimonies, and intense spiritual pressure, often responded with adrenaline-fueled excitement. Many genuinely believed something supernatural had happened until reality returned hours, days, or weeks later. Still, Benny Hinn's downfall did not come from exposés alone. In later years, mounting criticism, financial scrutiny, and internal family disputes led him to make an unexpected confession. In 2019, during a live stream, Hinn publicly repented for aspects of his ministry, especially the prosperity gospel techniques that demanded seed offerings in exchange for miracles. "I think it's an offense to the Lord," he said. "The gospel is not for sale." Critics argued this confession was too little and decades too late, but it nonetheless signaled a shift in tone. Today, Benny Hinn remains active, still preaching, still drawing large crowds, but the trust he once held has been permanently altered. For many former followers, he represents one of the most high-profile examples of how emotional vulnerability and religious authority can collide in a way that looks like hope but feels like betrayal once the lights go off. The legacy of investigations, unverified healings, and televised exposés stands as a stark warning. Sometimes the loudest miracles are merely echoes of staged belief, engineered for the camera rather than delivered by God. Case 8. Todd Bentley. Todd Bentley burst onto the scene like a wildfire no one could contain. Tattoos, denim, raw energy, and a voice that sounded more like a rock concert frontman than a minister, he ignited the Lakeland revival in Florida in 2008 and drew hundreds of thousands of desperate people seeking a miracle. Night after night, the crowds pressed forward as Bentley shouted testimonies of cancer disappearing, blindness healed in seconds, deaf ears popping open, and yes, even the dead being raised back to life. His message was simple and electrifying. The supernatural wasn't coming someday. It was happening right now, in this room, if you just believed enough. At the climax of these revivals, people would fall to the floor, scream, shake, and claim immediate transformation. But beneath the roar of worship music and TV cameras hovering overhead, something else was happening. Something that would eventually tear the revival apart. Bentley's healing techniques became legendary and bizarre. He was known for yelling commands at illnesses, punching stomach tumors, and even kicking people in the face because God told him to. One story went viral when Bentley claimed that he healed a man by kicking him so hard in the stomach that the tumor popped. The crowd cheered. News outlets raised eyebrows. Bentley told stories of calling mortuaries and hearing reports of the dead rising after someone watched one of his services. The revival messaging machine pumped out verified testimonies. But when journalists and medical professionals asked for names, proof, or medical documentation, suddenly those once public stories became vague, unverifiable, or conveniently lost. Then came the investigation. Reporters from ABC News, Nightline, and the Associated Press began calling hospitals, families, and local health officials. They asked simple questions. Who was healed? What was the diagnosis? Were medical records available? Over and over, the answer came back the same. No verified evidence, no medical documentation, and in many cases, no trace of the people Bentley claimed were miraculously cured. Former staff members started to speak up, saying healing claims were announced first and checked later, if they were checked at all. One internal worker admitted that many stories were simply faith interpretations, meaning if someone said they felt better, Bentley's team counted it as a healing. Feelings became facts, sensations became testimonies, and then those testimonies turned into fundraising material. The exposure began slowly, a drip of unsettling questions, followed by an avalanche of scrutiny, and then, almost overnight, the Lackland revival collapsed. But it wasn't a journalist who finally took the revival down. It was Bentley himself. While claiming the holiness of God's power on stage, he entered into a highly inappropriate relationship off stage, shocking the very movement that defended him. The governing board removed him from ministry leadership. He was later confronted publicly, with leaders admitting there had been no attempt to verify healing claims before broadcasting them as miracles. The revival that promised global transformation ended in scandal, secrecy, and quiet resignation. Years later, after attempts at restoration, Bentley resurfaced, but the original promise of unstoppable supernatural power had evaporated. The audiences grew smaller, the testimonies slowed, and everywhere he went, the question followed him. Where is the proof? Churches that once cheered him on became cautious, distant, and in many cases, embarrassed. Bentley's downfall didn't just expose one preacher's reckless claims. It forced an entire charismatic movement to confront a painful truth. When miracles become marketing, people get hurt, trust gets shattered, and faith becomes a stage performance. Bentley never produced the verified healings he shouted into microphones. And long after the music died down in Lakeland, the stories of those unverified miracles remain echoes of a revival built on emotion, hype, and claims that never stood up to the simplest test. Truth. Case 9. Jack Coe. The tent was packed so tightly that night in 1956 that ushers had to hold back crowds from spilling into the aisles. Jack Coe strode onto the platform with a booming voice and a showman's confidence that electrified every inch of canvas above him. He always chose his moments carefully. As the choir faded, Coe called for parents to bring forward a young girl in a wheelchair, her braces gleaming under the harsh revival lights. He announced that God had revealed to him this child would walk that night. The audience gasped, people cried, hands reached upward in ecstatic praise. Coe laid his hands on her, shouted for healing, and then ordered the parents to throw away her braces forever. The tent erupted. Testimonies roared. Coe declared victory. It was the kind of moment that kept the money flowing into the offering buckets and his legend circulating across the South. But outside the revival grounds, reality waited. The girl's parents obeyed Coe's instruction, believing that her braces were no longer needed. They returned home filled with hope, but the miracle never came. Their daughter could not walk without those braces. Her condition hadn't changed, and without the medical support she relied on, she suffered unnecessary pain and risked permanent damage. Outraged, the family contacted authorities, and soon, for the first time in American history, a faith healer found himself staring down criminal charges. Jack Coe was arrested in Florida for practicing medicine without a license. Newspapers seized on the story, turning Coe into a national headline overnight. The man who healed the crippled girl was suddenly the preacher who endangered a child by staging a miracle. The trial became one of the earliest tests of accountability in the world of faith healing. Lawyers argued that Coe manipulated desperate families with false promises, urging them to abandon medical treatment in exchange for theatrical demonstrations of divine power. Supporters rallied outside the courthouse, claiming the government was attacking religion. Detractors saw something different: a charismatic performer using faith as a prop. Although the charges were ultimately dropped, the damage was already done. Investigators and journalists began asking deeper questions about Coe's ministry. Former insiders spoke about the tactics designed to build dramatic moments, selecting healing cases that created emotional impact but left behind lives in disarray once the spotlight faded. Behind the scenes, Coe had perfected a formula common to mid-century tent revivalism. He traveled with large teams, controlled testimony flow from the platform, and built suspense through prayer lines carefully arranged to produce moments of shock and awe. If something didn't appear miraculous, he simply moved on to the next person, while music swelled loud enough to drown confusion. His reputation soared, and thousands traveled across the country to receive his touch, believing nothing was impossible under that tent. But the Florida case cracked the illusion wide open. It forced people to confront a truth that many suspected, but couldn't prove. Some miracles were nothing more than spiritual theater. Jack Coe continued preaching, but the scandal never truly disappeared. He died suddenly of illness just months later, ending his ministry before long-term accountability reached him. Yet his story didn't fade. It became one of the foundational examples investigators and reporters used for decades when examining miracle claims. To this day, Coe's case is a reference point in debates about faith healing, medical ethics, and the responsibility of religious leaders who claim supernatural power over illness. The night he told a family to throw away their daughter's braces became a symbol not of divine intervention, but of the danger that comes when charisma replaces truth. Case 10, Brother R.G. Stair. Long before national audiences began questioning miracle evangelists, Brother R. Stair had crafted a reputation as the grizzled prophet of a remote South Carolina compound, where radio waves carried his voice across the country. He spoke with a cracked, booming intensity, promising healing, supernatural deliverance, and prophetic breakthroughs to listeners who mailed in prayer requests and donations. Followers called him Brother Stair, trusting his claims that he had cured illnesses, restored failing bodies, and interceded with God in ways that doctors could never match. But behind the confident voice on radio and the dramatic healing testimonies was a history of manipulation, staging, and deception that ultimately ended not only his ministry's credibility, but his freedom. For years, Stair broadcast healing testimonies from his ministry headquarters, a self-sustaining farm he referred to as a place of divine refuge. Listeners heard men and women declare that he had cured them of tumors, heart disease, blindness, and other illnesses simply through prayer. He demanded urgency. If you didn't respond when God prompted you to give, he warned, you risked missing your miracle. But former members later revealed that these so-called healings were not spontaneous moves of God. Stair, they said, pressured followers to claim healings even when nothing had happened. Some were instructed to stop taking medication as an act of faith and were publicly shamed if they later reported no improvement. One former follower claimed Stair would read healing testimonies on air that had been prepared in advance or recycle stories from different people as if they were new supernatural events. The facade began to unravel as former followers came forward, not only to contest the healing claims, but to level far darker allegations. Several women stepped forward, accusing Stair of coercive sexual behavior, spiritual intimidation, and physical control. Investigators eventually opened formal cases. Stair was arrested multiple times over the course of his career, and in one major set of criminal proceedings, he pleaded guilty to charges including assault and criminal sexual conduct. As reporters descended on his compound, the myth of a miracle-working man of God collapsed under the weight of statements, testimonies, and the sheer number of affected lives that contradicted everything he had preached. In court, the healing claims that once filled his radio sermons turned into evidence of manipulation. Prosecutors described a pattern of control. Stair would present himself as a prophet capable of divine healing, then use that authority to create dependency, fear, and compliance. Followers who had believed they were witnessing supernatural events now said they were witnessing rehearsed, repeated performances. A man using religious language as cover for psychological and physical dominance. Brother Stair ultimately served multiple prison sentences over the years, and though he continued broadcasting after his releases, the ministry never recovered the same national reach or public trust. In the final years of his life, surrounded by legal controversy and dwindling support, he continued preaching miracle healings and prophecies, but the voice on the radio sounded more isolated, more desperate to regain a control that had permanently slipped away. His death did not restore his reputation. Instead, it finalized the story many had been trying to tell for decades, that behind the glowing radio testimonies and nightly broadcasts of supernatural claims, real people were hurt, deceived, and left to pick up the pieces. In the end, the so-called healing prophet became remembered not for miracles, but for manipulation. A cautionary tale of how easily religious authority can be weaponized when no one is allowed to question it. The deeper you go into these stories, the more one truth becomes impossible to ignore. None of these miracles ever needed to be medically verified because the real power wasn't in healing bodies, it was in controlling belief. That is the thread that ties every case together, whether it was a hidden earpiece whispering secret details, a stash of thrift store crutches used to stage dramatic walk-offs, or holy water discovered to be contaminated with bacteria. The illusion always required one thing above all else: a crowd ready to believe. Think back over the faces and ministry empires we've just walked through. Bright lights, televised testimonies, men and women collapsing on the floor, shaking, crying, declaring they were healed. Then the aftermath: lawsuits, resignations, arrests, documentaries, laboratory results, and broken families asking how they could have been fooled. In every case, there's a moment when the curtain gets pulled back and the entire congregation realizes the truth has been hidden in plain sight. That moment is always devastating. Not just because the miracle was fake, but because the trust was real. And that's what makes these stories hit so hard. It's not just fraud. It's betrayal dressed up in religious language. It's hope being transformed into currency. It's desperation being turned into spectacle. These preachers understood something chilling. When people are in pain, they will cling to whoever promises relief. Even if that promise comes with a price. That price was money, loyalty, silence, shame, and in some cases, criminal behavior that stuck to people's lives long after the cameras turned off and the crowds went home. Now we turn it over to you. Which of these fake healing scandals shocked you the most? Let us know what you think down in the comment section. We read every single one. Before you go, if you love deep dive true crime exposés like this one, please take 2 seconds and subscribe to Savage Case Files. It supports the work and it tells us you want more high-quality investigative stories every single day. Your subscription genuinely helps keep this channel going. Thanks for watching, and remember, if someone demands money in exchange for a miracle, look closer, ask questions, and never stop thinking for yourself.